Great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for making this room packed. It's wonderful to have you all here, and wonderful. Often at events relating to climate and sustainability in Cape Town, we hear the refrain, oh, it's all the same old faces. And I think we've got a lot of new faces here today, so thank you. So my background is as a science journalist and a human rights journalist. I worked with the Mail and Guardian, I worked with the Treatment Action Campaign, and I've been looking at climate change for the last 15 years, and I've been working on divestment as a strategy for addressing climate change for the last 6 years. Our campaign started with asking the University of Cape Town to divest its endowment from fossil fuels, and last year, happily, we got an initial, very tentative agreement from the new Vice-Chancellor that that principle is now tentatively accepted, and that what we are waiting for is implementation. But we've had a lot of discussions with asset managers over the last couple of years as well, and we've asked asset managers to create the kinds of funds that would make divestment possible for those early movers who want to move, who want to get their funds out of big carbon as soon as possible. And the pushback from asset managers very often, with exceptions, but very often has been talk to the asset owners. And so here we are today talking to the asset owners, so thank you for coming. So why are we doing this? Well, we believe that retirement funds can help build a stronger, low-carbon, prosperous, equitable, and sustainable future for everyone. Not just your members, but for everyone, for the societies that we inhabit and that we depend on, by divesting from fossil fuels and reinvesting in the renewable and sustainable economy. That's the headline. We realize that there are a lot of details and practicalities that lie behind that process. So retirement fund beneficiaries face physical, social, and financial risks from being invested in fossil fuels. There are huge hidden costs to sticking with what I refer to as the carbon development paradigm, which is the idea that is so dominant here in South Africa that to run a modern economy, we absolutely have to have fossil fuels as part of the mix. That was true at one time, but it's no longer true. It's an assumption that has been rendered irrelevant over the last 10 years by the enormous progress in renewable energy technology and our understanding of the ways that we need to run the other sectors of our economy. So we argue that divestment is ethical, prudent, and practical. So this movement started in good part because of the work of a grassroots climate organization called 350. And one of its early leaders is a climate activist in the US called Bill McKibben. And Bill McKibben says if it's wrong to wreck the planet, it's wrong to profit from doing the wrecking. And so that's one of the first arguments that we make about divestment, is that remaining invested in fossil fuel companies when you have the choice is immoral. There's another very powerful argument that's been made, which is that the capital that is still invested in fossil fuel companies is capital that is sitting in the wrong place that could be hunting out better opportunities in the emerging sustainable economy. So every bit of capital sitting with Sasol that could be in renewable energy is capital that is missing an opportunity for generating far larger social and environmental returns. There's another important point which I think is little understood in South Africa, which is that the fossil fuel industry has fought for decades to conceal the reality of climate change. And even now, even when they have, in some instances, stood up and said we support climate change regulation, when they've said we support international action on climate change, in many instances, still behind the scenes in places like the European Parliament, they are lobbying behind the scenes to water down climate action. And here in South Africa, for example, there's no better example than Sasol's lobbying against the carbon tax. And if we consider Sasol's carbon tax liabilities up against the enormous damage that that company does, their protests are disingenuous, to say the least. So this is just to, and yesterday I ran out of time with this presentation, so I'm giving you the headlines first, then I'll go into some more details. This is one example. The European Parliament, for example, is holding hearings earlier this year into Exxon's climate science denial. So I think there are a lot of people who, in South Africa and elsewhere, who doubt the reality of climate change, still doubt the reality of climate change or that human beings play a role. But the fact that they have, for years, been able to Google climate change and come up with a sea of absolute disinformation is in good part due to the fact that these fossil fuel companies, particularly internationally, have generated misinformation and propaganda around the reality of climate change on an industrial scale. And I won't go into that in too much detail, but the paper trail is there for anyone to see. I recently came across a video made by Royal Dutch Shell in 1991, which shows very, very clearly the sort of projected climate warming effects that we're now starting to see. These companies have actually known about the scientific reality of climate change for decades, but have sought to obscure it in their public relations. So this is a statement from Morné du Plessis of WWF South Africa. He's saying, South Africa's economic development should not be held hostage by special pleading from a limited number of high-carbon companies who represent themselves as business and even the economy. So this is the headline section finished. This is where the presentation starts. So I want to talk about a 1 in 4.5 billion year transition that I think most economists and policymakers don't really grasp. The huge hidden costs of sticking with this carbon development paradigm, and the potential for transition, the scale of the fossil fuel divestment movement internationally, and why retirement funds should be considering divestment in the long-term interests of your funds, your members, and the people who depend on those vehicles. And I think one of the things that we little appreciate when we start to this discussion is that individual wealth and prosperity as we experience it is a function not just of what sits in our bank accounts, but the environment, both social, physical, and environmental, that we inhabit. It means nothing to have money if you do not have a reliable water supply. It means nothing to have money if you don't have clean air to breathe and food that you can rely on to nourish your body. So the most basic infrastructure of the economy is the environment. We forget this because we've been able to take it for granted for 99% of our history as humanity. And all the social and legal and political systems that we've evolved in an earlier era before we started to hit certain very critical environmental thresholds. But we all depend on clean, breathable air, clean water, safe and healthy food, a stable climate and weather, and a multitude of living beings surrounding us all the time who are producing food, forests, and waste sinks that we are all dependent on. So the very structure of our atmosphere and the biosphere that we inhabit is determined by life. 4.5 billion years ago, the atmosphere was nitrogen, methane, and carbon dioxide, large amounts of carbon dioxide. It's only 2.5 billion years ago that oxygen started to be a significant component of our atmosphere. This is the moon Titan of Saturn. It had an atmosphere similar to ours 4.5 billion years ago. Life has brought this transformation. But what's happened in the last 200 years? Our population, which for generations upon generations was relatively small, has absolutely accelerated with massive knock-on environmental consequences. This means that from the early 1970s, as a planet, we have been living in ecological debt. That means that our collective demands on the environment are greater than that environment can actually renew. So countries that it doesn't surprise us to hear on ecological debt, for example, are the United States, most of Europe, China, India, the Middle East, but also very much South Africa. When you add all this up together, by the way, the world as a whole is in ecological debt. So let's break this down a little bit to the company level. I think campaigners like myself can sometimes forget that companies produce many positives for society. But they also produce, in many instances, a great many negative externalities, which often don't get properly measured. And those can include pollution, wildlife loss, soil and land degradation, occupational health problems, corruption, labor and human rights abuse, and business malpractices, in the worst instances. Of course, in many instances, these are by far the dominant side of the equation. So let's break this down and look at Sasol, and this does not pretend to be a completely exhaustive accounting for Sasol's positive negative impacts. But some of the headlines. Earnings for Sasol in 2018 were $3.367 billion, 3.67 billion rand. Sasol's carbon emissions in 2018, 67.4 million tons. There's a concept called the social cost of carbon, which attempts to account for the collective likely future and present damage which is being done by each individual ton of carbon. The Obama administration used a cost of $45 per ton of carbon dioxide to try and understand how much damage that would likely do to the environment and society. If we add that up, that comes to 45 billion rands worth of damage being done by Sasol's carbon dioxide emissions alone. And that's before we start to talk about the considerable problems caused by Sasol's air pollution, where it grotesquely fails to meet even the minimum emission standards that we have, and is lobbying for a reduction in those standards that would be approximately 10 times weaker than the equivalent standard in India and 28 times weaker than the equivalent standard in China. So what's the alternative? At a big picture level, there are certain characteristics that we see with the old extractivist economy that we're living in, and we're particularly an extractivist economy in South Africa because of our history of mining. It's a model that imposes external costs from business production on people and society. It responds to depletion by seeking out new resources to exploit. We have a linear resource flow, mining to waste, and we have got to the point where our agriculture essentially resembles mining, which is that it destroys soils and nature. The alternative that we need to be moving towards globally is a new economy that is regenerative, that seeks to create commonwealth and well-being, that aims to avoid depletion and cultivate and maintain existing resources, that moves away from a linear resource flow to a zero waste economy, a circular resource flow, and that sees part of the objectives of agriculture as being cultivation, to build soils and to work with nature. So, the immense costs of continued fossil fuel dependency, or this carbon development paradigm that I was talking about. There's something called the resource curse, which is the paradox that countries with an abundance of natural resources, such as fossil fuels, tend to have less economic growth and worse development outcomes. It seems paradoxical, but it's an observed economic fact. The early effects of climate change for South Africa have been quantified by one Stanford University study as already being 10% of our GDP. The air pollution costs that we experience in South Africa, putting aside the human costs, are equivalent to 6% of GDP. And in that particular study talks about 29,000 premature deaths annually. That's an enormous amount of human suffering. One of the consequences of our extractivist economy is that we have extreme inequality. And we have corruption which is highly associated with the fossil fuel and extractive industries, which we've already talked about here today. One of the other major problems and characteristics of our society is that we're one of the most unequal countries in the world. And climate change acts as an extreme inequality multiplier. And the damaging effects of air pollution are only now really properly being understood by scientists. On the upside, we're looking at a renewable energy transition that has far outpaced the expectations of pretty much everyone. Ironically, if you look at the various studies done by the IEA in the early 2000s, projections that were done then, the one body that came closest to projecting the actual success of wind and solar energy was Greenpeace. So next time you cast a cynical eye at a Greenpeace report, consider that fact. We tend to think of renewables as being something that are adopted by developed countries in particular, but already the uptake of renewable energy is now greater in developing countries than it is in developed countries. 53 countries have 100% renewable energy targets. 44% of those headed for 100% by 2050. These are some of the countries that have targets, and many of them are developing countries. What about jobs? We talked about the incredible importance of jobs. There are studies, numerous studies, not only showing that in countries that have moved some way towards this transition, jobs are being created. There are jobs lost as well. These numbers here, 52 million created globally by 2050 across 139 countries, and jobs lost 27.7 million. It's important to note that that is a projection that is done without talking about a managed transition. So if you have a managed transition, you can greatly offset some of that job destruction that might happen. The projections for South Africa for the potential for renewable energy, we all know the enormous crisis that our national utility is in, holding our entire economy hostage in a sense. There are analysts, Tobias Bishop-Niems, who was a former Eskom employee and formerly headed up a unit at the CSIR looking into energy policy, says that South Africa can decarbonize our energy system at negative cost, which is not something that you see often repeated in the reporting around this issue. So the global divestment movement, it was in part inspired by the anti-apartheid investment movement and led in its early stages by 350. Glenn is here from 350 today. At the moment, the total value of the institutions that have divested internationally is around $9.94 trillion. Of course, not everybody who's divesting is actually declaring that divestment. So there may be many institutions that are not moving quietly out of fossil fuels because they see the risks, but are not making it a headline. There are over 1,116 institutions that have divested, and 58,000 individuals divesting about $5.2 billion. Pension funds are 14% of that number, 101,000 organizations that have chosen to divest. Some of the big organizations that have, or most prominent organizations that have made this decision, New York City, Ireland, an entire country, very significantly. Ireland is dropping coal, gas, and oil investments from its Island Strategic Investment Fund. So again, I want to make the point that if we think about the future environment that retirement fund beneficiaries will be inhabiting, we need to think not just about their access to financial capital, but also their access to the other dimensions of natural and manufactured capital on which we all depend. And those are all placed at risk by climate change. This is Noordhoek Manor here in Cape Town. I bring it up because my own parents will be moving there in a couple of months' time. This is the scenes at Noordhoek Manor in 2015. Of course, we've had wildfires in Cape Town forever, but the incidence of wildfires and the effects of wildfires are worsening in the Western Cape, partly as a consequence of climate change. Of course, there are dimensions to human management as well that greatly contribute to that risk as well. This is a case study of a pension fund in the UK that has set about divestment. This is the Waltham Forest Municipal Pension Fund. I lived in Walthamstow for a few months a few years ago. In September 2016, the fund agreed that within 5 years it would divest from fossil fuel equity investments, saying that there would be better returns achieved by investing in the future low-carbon economy. They set about a 5-year process. They face a constraint, which is that they have to use funds from within something called the London Collective Investment Vehicle. In the process, they have started to increase their exposure to global equities. They've appointed new managers. Their global equities exposure has gone down, in fossil fuels has gone down to 2.1% from 14%. But because of some of the vehicles that they were in, so their UK exposure has actually increased. But their total oil, gas, and coal exposure has decreased to this degree from around 7% in March 2017 to March 2019, about 3% now. So it's a process, we understand that, and it's something that has to be done slowly and carefully in accord with the best advice that you can get from the many service providers who would probably be happy to. 2 minutes, right. So there are some objections that are often raised to divestment. I think Coronation states some of those. They say we can more effectively press for positive change by being an active, engaged investor than by sitting on the sidelines. But the fact is that most asset managers in South Africa are not substantively engaging on climate change issues with their investee companies yet. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, I emailed Carl Leinberger at Coronation in advance of this event, asking for examples of Coronation's engagement with companies on climate issues. I haven't had a reply. He may not have seen the email, so, but But the point is that engagement and divestment can work hand in hand. They do not have to be exclusive tactics. And I would say if you started out your process of engagement with fossil fuel companies with a really robust climate engagement policy, that would be fantastic. But but understand the deadlines that we're up against. We need to cut carbon emissions, as the IPCC has told us, by 45%, and that's over a 2010 deadline, a 2010 baseline, by 2030. That means what you need to be saying to investee companies is, you need targets for reducing your emissions. Sasol, you need targets for reducing your emissions 45% by 2030. Show us how you're going to do that. There are other companies that are doing that. There's an organization called Science-Based Targets. There are Australia's Origin Energy has set itself targets for decarbonization at a pace that is consistent with the science-based targets. That is what we need from our South African energy companies as well. The Danish oil and natural gas company Divest has switched over the past 15 years from being 90% fossil fuel intensive to being 90% renewable energy. This transition is possible. It can be done where there is the will. Another objection that sometimes comes is that no fund can be 100% fossil free. Of course, when we're all embedded in a carbon-based, carbon-intensive economy, that's true, but that's not a reason not to start acting. So I close again with this reminder that the wealth that our experience of wealth and prosperity depends not on what we have just in our bank accounts or what we receive as benefits from our retirement fund, but also the environment that we inhabit. Thank you.